And for the next 8 or 10 years, that's the way it was. We were able to publish the clutch hitting couldn't come out until 2 years after the BRA publication, because that was the rule.
Oh, really? Wow. What was BRA?
That was a rather poorly chosen acronym. We
Yes.
spell it out for
Batter run average.
Yeah, for on-base time slugging percentage. I didn't get it for a long time. I didn't get it for a lot longer, believe me. But that's
Welcome back. Hope everyone had a good morning. And I'm particularly excited to announce about this panel, the Origins of Baseball Analytics. This is a panel we've spoken about doing for a while, and everyone on this panel and the moderator are people who I've known for a while, some of whom I've worked closely with, and I think, they're all instrumental in, we wouldn't have this analytics conference today if it wasn't for everyone here. And I think, everyone's going to enjoy this panel. Let me introduce the panelists. Dick Cramer is an early pioneer in baseball statistical analysis, and with Pete Palmer, he co-founded SABR's groundbreaking statistical analysis committee in the 70s and was involved in founding STATS Inc. Dick? John Dewan is currently the owner of Baseball Info Solutions, which collects, analyzes, and disseminates the most in-depth data in the industry with more than a dozen Major League Baseball teams as clients. And before founding BIS, John was president and CEO of STATS Inc.
did a whole good job, too.
Pete Palmer co-authored with John Thorn The Hidden Game of Baseball, and remains a touchstone for sabermetric thought. From 1989 through 2001, he and John Thorn published 7 editions of the groundbreaking encyclopedia Total Baseball, and I could go on, but Pete Palmer. John Thorn, as many of you know, is the official historian of Major League Baseball. He was named MLB's official historian by Commissioner Seelig in 2011. He's a recipient of SABR's Harry Chadwick Award, the Bob Davids Award. His works go on, was involved with Baseball in the Garden of Eden, The Secret History of the Early Game. He's the founder of McFarland's Baseball, a journal of the early game, creator of SABR's The National Pastime, and I've got a whole page here. I could go on. He's also a very close friend, John Thorn. And it seemed only fitting that we get another John to moderate it, since John seems to be the name with this panel. And John Walsh is the former executive vice president and executive editor at ESPN. John was instrumental in so many things that ESPN did. His fingerprints have been on many of the network's largest initiatives and launches. He served as executive vice president and executive editor for more than 2 decades, oversaw the launch of ESPN the magazine, ESPN radio, did many things with TV, could also go on, but we want to get this panel going. John Walsh. And once again with this panel, if you have questions, there are going to be note cards in the back, and then they will be collected, and about 10-15 minutes before, we'll bring them up here, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for this illustrious panel, and I'll leave it over now to John Walsh.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's really an honor to be up here with these distinguished gentlemen, and as Mark intimated, this conference probably wouldn't exist if it weren't for the panelists who are here today, with all of their groundbreaking work over the years. First, I want to say as little as possible. I want to get the conversation going among people from whom you can learn something. But I am required to say that the Hidden Game of Baseball is being republished, and you can purchase it. And the other promotion is John Dewan has a book out called The Fielding Bible, combining baseball and religion, and letting us know that God does play defense. So we had a little meeting beforehand a couple of hours ago about what to discuss, and I want to start with John Thorn and ask the question, what's the litmus test the panel all agreed that 90% of the numbers that are out there really aren't that important. What's the litmus test for something being a good concept, a good theory, a good number? And John Thorn, let's start with you.
When you asked me this question in email, John, I declared I had no litmus test, but subsequently I've come to think that maybe I do. That if a new analytics measure correlates with runs and thus with wins, that's a good litmus test. Otherwise, it might just be window dressing. Pitcher strikeouts for a long time I thought were irrelevant because the pitcher's mandate was merely to get out of the inning without allowing runs. It didn't much matter how. Then fielding independent pitching came in and kind of changed my mind about that. I would say another litmus test for me is ease of comprehension, not ease of calculation, because who out here will know precisely how to calculate earned run average? Very few of you, and this is an analytics conference. So it's, can the concept be grasped, and does it correlate with victory?
Anybody have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think it should predict something, and it should predict it reproducibly. It should, if you think you've detected something about a player, is that chance or is that a quality of the player? And I think the test there is, does it keep happening in a predictive sense? Can you predict what's going to happen next year from what happened last year for that stat, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, Dick. And that's something we do when we look at our analytics, the predictive element. And the way we do predictive testing is kind of going backwards by seeing if the stat works backwards and forwards. So, for example, we do this thing called even and odd year testing. And we want to make sure that if you combine all the players' stats in their even-numbered years and it matches up in all their odd-numbered years, it looks like it's a consistent stat. And another way that, for me personally, if you're doing some kind of new stat, it has to make sense based on what you see on the field. So I've specialized in defensive analytics, and a lot of our analytics are showing that some players, like Derek Jeter, who get won Gold Gloves, it didn't make sense that he should have won them based on our analytics. But for the most part, the analytics have to match up with the general conception of what's on the field. So, a lot of players won Gold Gloves historically, and it's the defensive analytics, the numbers have to correspond to what people see in general, not necessarily in every case, but in general.
Pete, you were there in the beginning when everything started to take form in the 70s. What was it like convincing people that new numbers might matter? What was it like when you were in the early 70s, when you were trying to convince people that these new numbers might matter for understanding baseball?
Yeah, well, I enjoy doing it for its own sake, and I don't think I really considered what other people were going to relate to it. So it was more just for the fun of it, to be honest with you. And I had some disappointments along the way. For instance, my buddy Paul McFarland at the Sporting News and I were corresponding, and I had written this paper about some of the player evaluation stuff that I had done, and he was going to get it published, and unfortunately, this was 1969 now, somebody higher up there decided it was too complicated, and they killed it at the last minute, and that was very disappointing to me. But luckily, I don't know, there's a fellow, Simon Morong, who has a baseball site, and I gave him a copy of the paper and he posted it there. So, how many years ago? 45 years ago? That's what I was doing. But I don't know. I mean, I never really thought it was enough to do it just for its own sake. And luckily, John came along and turned it in English and made people understand it. And of course, Bill James was very instrumental by publishing this baseball abstract in his basement in 1977. And by the time we did our book, he had like 100,000 readers, didn't he, or something like that? So, and Rob Nair, of course, was helping him. And that was a big step as far as getting other people interested in it. And, well, like when Kramer and I got together, we were the Statistical Analysis Committee, right? You and me?
Two people.
Yep.
And Dick sent me a study he'd done about on-base average times slugging average being proportional to team runs, and I had actually done the same thing. We came at it from different directions, but we convinced SABR, which at that point was not particularly statistically or analytically interested, but we were able to get it published in the research journal. And then a couple of years later, I had this idea that on-base time slugging is nice, and it wasn't anything new, really. Earnshaw Cook in the early 60s had come up with a similar formula, and Bill James's runs created was really on-base time slugging times at bat, so it's not that wonderful a discovery, but I decided, you know, that's complicated. So if you do on-base plus slugging, you can add it up in your head, and it's just as good. And the only thing is, when you multiply them together, it works better for extreme cases. But for cases near the normal situation that you find, it works perfectly fine. So it took a while to catch on, but I'm glad that it did.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at the inventor of OPS right there.
And the process.
OPS.
I remember one of the first contacts in '71 again, where I approached the Phillies, my team, about a player in their roster. And it seems so strange today that walks by batters were totally ignored by all decision makers at that time, partly because the information wasn't available. So I told them about this guy, John Briggs, who was in their roster. They should really give him more playing time because he had a good on-base average. And the Phillies, 2 weeks later, traded him to Milwaukee. So for a guy named Pete Kogel, and if you haven't heard of him, that's probably
why.
that's appropriate.
Dick, tell the story about how you and Pete took the survey with the Society of American Baseball Research.
Yeah, I must start by saying that obviously Pete and I were introduced by SABR, so SABR really is the basis for sabermetrics starting to be a one-man operation sort of sporadically, as Earnshaw Cook was, and starting to become, if you like, a movement. But the editor, Bob Davids, our original leader, was not very enthusiastic about this number stuff. He wanted to do history. And so I grumbled because I thought, gee, this is research, we ought to be able to publish it. He said, why don't you do a survey of our membership? I said, that's reasonable. So I sent out a questionnaire, and Bob knew his constituency very well. Our membership did not want any of that numbers junk. They wanted history. And so I negotiated with Bob, and we were able to publish one paper every 2 years in the Baseball Research Journal. One of the ones that came out later was this clutch hitting thing, which Pete and I keep saying, hey, you know, the data don't really, it's hard to see that, but human intuition being what it is, we all feel pressure. I'm sure that matter will never be settled. But that was one of the later papers at the time.
But John Thorn, you're the historian among us now, officially anointed. How do you see where we are today relative to the history that began, I would say, probably in an aggressive way in the early to mid-'70s? Where are we today with the popularity, the existence, the following, the understanding of baseball fans with respect to the numbers that are being used?
John, I would agree that the dawn of the movement is the 70s, but I would say it was the 1870s. And you have to look back to Henry Chadwick, and you have to look back to F.C. Lane and Al Monroe Elias and others whom I'm forgetting. And there were people who were doing outstanding work in the 60s. We had George Lindsay in Operations Research Journal, vital papers that no baseball fan ever read. These were technical publications. So when people like Pete and Dick and Dallas Adams and Bill James and other people who were really there at the outset, and I was not one of them. I was absolutely a latecomer. You know, Dick said that SABR at the very least provided a basis for introducing Palmer and Kramer. And thus, we had a statistical analysis committee of two. SABR was also the introducer of Thorn to Palmer, Palmer to Thorn. I had not known him, though I had known of him, and it was at a SABR convention in Toronto in 1981. I was assigned to cover it by the Sporting News, and the very first persons I met were at a mixer like we had last night, Pete Palmer and Bob Carroll. And I think, Pete, that among the three of us, we probably produced about 30 books together over the next 20 years, for better or worse.
So where are we today?
Where we are today is at the crest of a distant wave. We are still nowhere near the shore, if the shore is the goal. I think that in very recent memory, I said that we're pretty good on measuring hitting and pretty good on measuring pitching. We know how to correlate that sabermetrically through the runs and wins ratio that Pete discovered to victory. But that fielding was the great mystery, it was unmeasurable, and would likely remain so. I said this within my memory, and my memory probably goes back 8 or 10 years, that's about all. And we have on this panel John Dewan, who has proved me a liar.
John Dewan, what do you see that isn't being done now that should be being done?
Well, just to pick up on what John said about, you know, we're riding the crest of a distant wave, and I totally agree with that. My own thought is 100 years from now, there's going to be a SABR Analytics Conference or something like it, and there's going to be 5 old geezers up here like us, and they're going to say, back in the 2080s, we did this wonderful stuff, and it's so hard to believe we're doing all this new stuff now. So I think the discovery of new analytics is never ending. I think there will always be things to research. There will always be new discoveries that we make in baseball alone, let alone all the other sports. So, you know, I think that, you know, just to give a couple of examples, some of the work that we recently did, and it's based on work that was previously done, and that is understanding that a pitch called for a strike isn't always a strike, and that there are certain players involved who can make strikes happen more often than others. So it's called catcher framing, and certain catchers have a better ability of getting called strikes than others. But it's also a factor of the other 3 people participating in the pitch. The pitcher has a lot of influence on whether borderline pitches are called to strike. The batter, there are certain batters who are more likely to get borderline pitches as strikes, and as well as, of course, the single most important person in calling strikes is the umpire. And our analytics have shown that the umpires, you know, can cost the team, you know, 20 runs over the course of a season, or cost the players, or get them at extra 20 runs. But you know, the second part of this is new analytics going forward. We are now on the verge of being able to begin to analyze the largest single database of information ever to be developed in one single game John said this at lunch today. In one single game, we will have more information than Pete Palmer had when he was studying the entire history of baseball. When the StatCast goes online and they're keeping track of every single movement by every single player of every single game, you're talking about billions of pieces of information within a game, and we'll have, that one season of that, we could probably analyze that for the next 100 years, let alone, what we're going to do in the next few seasons. So it's an exciting world to be part of, and if you're a baseball fan and if you're into analytics and, all you young guys out there, you're going to have a good time, man.
Why don't you give us a little commercial here for your book and tell us what's going on with the study of defensive analytics?
So that's been my baby for my entire life. I'll date myself also, as everybody else has here. So I read Bill James back in the early 80s, and he inspired me to get involved with baseball. I called him up. I stood up from my kitchen table, went to the phone after I read his book and said, all right, this guy's doing stuff in baseball that I'm doing in insurance, and I don't want to be an actuary in insurance anymore. I think baseball numbers are way more fun than insurance numbers. So I started getting involved with baseball, and my biggest thing that I was interested in was defensive analytics. So we had a thing called Project Scoresheet. We started gathering our own data at a SABR conference in Chicago in 1986, I think it was. I did a presentation about defensive analytics. And then working with Dick Cramer, we started working at STATS Incorporated.
That was great.
And
that was such a lot of fun.
We had a tremendous lot of fun gathering new data and developing. What we did there was we knew the zones where hitters were hitting the ball, and we could then analyze how the fielders were able to make those plays. So defensive analytics was always important. And now with even more in-depth data that we've gathered at my new company, Baseball Info Solutions, well, this is our 4th volume of the Fielding Bible, and at some point, I think God may come down and strike me dead and said, "You can't call this the Bible," but we did. It's a lot of fun, and it's again, like I said, it's never-ending research. There's always more things to study, and this next year, we're planning to separate range and positioning to see how batters, infielders and outfielders can perform, especially infielders, where we've collected data where they're positioned at the start of the play.
We have close to or approximately 100 years of research up here at this podium. Through the years, and we'll start maybe with you here, George, what one or two things surprised you? I said, boy, I never thought that this would be that way. What hit each of you as you studied something and said, wow, what a surprise that is?
Well, I mentioned the clutch hitting thing. I expected I was going to find an effect because we all know clutch hitting is important, right? But I looked at the data. There wasn't much data at the time, and that's not what the data said. And even today, I admit that even when my computer simulations are going good, I think my team is hot. I feel that way. That's the way you feel, even though intellectually I know it's not true. But I was really surprised to find that clutch hitting, as far as I'm concerned, is not a skill. It happens, but it's not a reproducible skill. And Pete and I have now looked at this in tremendous, for all the games that RetroSheet has. And take Ortiz. He certainly had some of the great clutch seasons of all time, but if you look at his whole career, there's nothing remarkable about him.
Okay, well, back in the 70s, I started keeping pitch-by-pitch accounts of the World Series games, and I forget, I might have had like 20, 30 games in there, and what I did was I calculated the batting performance based on the count. And for instance, if you had a ball and then a strike and then another ball, it would go under 1-0, 1-1, and 2-1, and then what the result was. And the results, which to me were amazing, was that if the first pitch was a ball, the batter's outcome for that at-bat was twice as productive than if the first pitch had been a strike. And to me, that was amazing because, for instance, if you take the 8th place hitter and give him a 1-0 count, he's a better batter than the third guy with an 0-1 count. And I think people over the years have understood that getting the first pitch over is a big help to the pitcher. But of course, you can't just throw it over the middle. But I don't think the degree of the difference between a ball and a strike was considered to be that much. I mean, if I look at a batter today, the first pitch is a strike, it doesn't faze him. He doesn't know that he's only going to be half as productive than if it had been a ball. And I don't know, there's not a lot you can do about it. I mean, you can just, as a pitcher, you can try to get the ball over, of course, over the corners. Or if you're a batter, if it's a good pitch, you can swing at it. If it's not, let it go. And I don't know if anybody's done much studying with the pitch stats they have now as far as batter selectivity. Does anybody know whether they've done anything with what batters are better at taking balls and hitting strikes compared to others?
Well, there's been some studies like that, but I don't have any nice anecdotes off the top of my head, sorry.
So, but to me, that was just amazing that the 8th place guy would be a better hitter with 1 ball than the 3rd place guy with 1 strike.
John Thorn?
I'll offer a garden variety insight. Remember, I'm coming to all this as someone who has loved baseball since the age of 5 and was a math major for a while and had the numbers always appealed to me. When you compound this with the English literature notion that appearance and reality are different things, a very routine insight today, but staggering to me in 1980 or so, was that Bill Terry's .401 batting average in 1930 and Carl Yastrzemski's .301 batting average in 1968, both league-leading figures, were precisely the same accomplishment in that each was approximately 32.5% above the league average. So taking Einstein's theory of relativity in this very crude form and applying it to baseball made me think that I could no longer trust any absolute number. And this realization, I think, was at about the time that Pete and I started working on Hidden Game and when we had already started to conceive total baseball. So a simple notion, probably obvious to everyone in this room, struck me as a thunderclap.
John Dewan?
So the thing that probably struck me the most over my career has to do with how often batters pull the ball. And just anecdotally, we looked at all the hitters in baseball and said, all right, how often do they pull grounders? And it turned out, on average, they pulled 67 to 70% of all grounders. This is the average hitter, all hitters in baseball. And they went, on fly balls, they generally went the other way about 53% of the time. So it struck me that maybe there should be a little more shifting going on. So it was 2006, and I hired this programmer from the University of Illinois. He had worked at Microsoft. He comes into my office, into the office. He sets up his 3 monitors. It's like, whoa! I think he knows what he's doing. And we created some parameters of, let's break the field into different sections and create some software that would visually show where each hitter hits the ball. And probably the most amazing thing that we found in 2006, and this was software we were developing to market to Major League Baseball teams. The most amazing thing we found was that it wasn't just Ortiz and Jim Thome and those guys that should be shifted. It was dozens and even up to 100 different players that should be shifted. And so in 2006, we started showing this to Major League teams. And they're like, nah, that's not, no, we don't do that. No, we're not interested in that. And I think we got one customer in 2006. So then we go back at it in 2007. No. Even the team that had bought it the previous year, no, we don't need that anymore. And I think we got 2 customers in 2008. And then the Tampa Bay Rays. The front office of the Tampa Bay Rays started studying this on our own. They didn't get the software from us. They did it themselves. And they're doing something that no one's ever done before, and they're shifting all over the place, or it seemed to be that they were shifting all over the place. They had 200 shifts in 2010 and 200 shifts in 2011. And they were very successful those years, and teams started saying, wow, look what they're doing. And it was so cool because this revolution of shifting in baseball, since I discovered this concept in 2006 that all these players should be shifted, and to see it actually happening, and the Astros shifted 1,300 times last year and saved 30 runs, 27 runs. It's really cool to see that happening in baseball, and it makes a lot of sense. It happens in other sports, right? Every sport has different defenses for different circumstances, football and all, so it should happen in baseball. So that was my biggest discovery, probably, the biggest thing that I saw in my career.
One of the things that I found at ESPN is one of the more difficult things that we have in all sports, and that is selling former coaches and former players that these numbers can help people understand the game better and have a deeper appreciation for it. What is being done, or what can be done? And we'll start with you again, John Thorn. What can be done to educate the people who are playing the game and who are analyzing the game, to have them understand how important these numbers might be?
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And Charles Barkley, in a celebrated recent example, indicated that sabermetrics belonged in the trash can as far as he was concerned. Michael Irvin, the Dallas Cowboys wide receiver, said pretty much the same thing until he was alerted to the fact that he had once had a season as a wide receiver that by sabermetric analysis was the single best in the last 30 years. This somewhat changed his view of the discipline.
That doesn't work for Joe Morgan, though.
I think when you reveal to retired players, look, John Kruk in yesterday's panel was amazed to learn that he was a god to this audience because he retired with a 397 on-base average, that he once had a 430 on-base average, that he was the Kevin Euclid, Greek god of his day. I think that it's a long process. The media adoption of baseball analytics is much more rapid than that of the players, and much more rapid also is that in the front office. So the players are feeling a little ganged up on, and they do not want to be treated robotically. They don't want to be told that they can't play against the left-handed pitcher, or if the wind is blowing out to left, the bigger guy is going to play instead of the littler guy. They don't want to be seen as interchangeable chess pieces. They don't want numbers and pencil neck guys like us telling them what to do when they've been playing the game at a very high level their entire lives. So this is an uphill battle with the players and will remain so in my estimation.
Well, I'm kicking here. I was at the MIT conference a couple of weeks ago in Boston, and I have two examples, one of them to demonstrate exactly what you're talking about as the learning process. Shane Battier was on a panel, and he was talking about exactly how players learn. And he was traded to Miami, and he was playing, and Shane told this story. He said, we're playing a game, and I'm noticing that Kevin Durant, that LeBron James is guarding, every shot is over his left shoulder. So the next time out in the huddle, Shane just went up and whispered in LeBron's ear, and he said, every shot Durant's taking is over the left shoulder. Durant didn't score the rest of the game. Shane Battier and LeBron James went up to Shane Battier's locker room right after the game was over and said, anytime you have an observation, please let me know. On the other end of it, there was a panel on, an opening panel on the PER in basketball and all the numbers that are being thrown around in basketball. And Jeff Van Gundy just threw this fit. He said, former coach, current ESPN broadcaster Jeff Van Gundy talked about plus minus in basketball. He said, if I have to read one more damn box score with plus minus, I think I'm going to shoot myself because it is a meaningless stat. What statistic means that is popular today that people look at and has less meaning than what the public may think?
Well, the obvious one is batting average, right? I mean, we all grew up on batting average, and, you know, a 300 hitter is great, and I'm relying on you guys here to educate the public, to let them know that OPS is way more important than batting average, and that the box scores should have OPS, not batting average, and the top 10 should not be batting average, it should be OPS. And hopefully 50 years from now, we'll be talking about, you know what, he's a 900 OPS guy, not a 300 hitter, he's a 900 hitter. So that's the obvious one, right?
And pitcher wins, where Brian Kenny mounted quite the effective intellectual campaign, of which eventually even he became tired of battling the pitcher win. Now, pitcher usage has changed remarkably over the last 40 years. I mean, I can remember when Oakland A's pitchers routinely completed 2/3 to 3/4 of their starts. So to award the entire win to the man who starts and goes 5 innings seems not to comport with the game, the way the game is played any longer. So just as batting average is an obvious vestigial stat, so are pitcher wins.
Well, one thing that I've thought about was in the old days when pitchers used to pitch most of the game, the runs allowed would be easily attributed to one pitcher or another. But now, what are we up to, 4 relief pitches a game or something like that? My friend Gary Gillette and I came up with this idea where when you left the game, you would be responsible for the runners who were on base, whether they scored or not. And then if the relief pitcher came in and he had allowed less runs than usual that would be scored from that situation, he would actually get a negative earned run allowed, and if he allowed more, he'd get a positive earned run allowed. Because the way it is now, if you come in and leave a runner on first and 2 outs, and a relief pitcher comes in and he allows a home run, you're charged with that run, even though the relief pitcher is more likely, has been a bigger contributor to it. And so, especially nowadays when pitchers are changing so often, I think they ought to consider at least giving some of the responsibility of the runs allowed to the starting pitcher and some to the reliever. I do a radio show occasionally called Stat of the Week, and the host is Mike Murphy in Chicago, and he said what you should do is if the guy's on third, when the relief pitcher enters the game, you give the starting pitcher 3/4 of a run if he scores, and 1/4 if he doesn't. If he's on second, it's half and half, and if he's on first, the relief pitcher gets 3/4, and the starting pitcher gets, or previous pitcher gets 1/4.
And fractional allocation of wins is not a crazy idea either.
Then there's the run batted in, and Tony La Russa obviously would say it's important from his comments this morning. On the other hand, it's sort of self-fulfilling. If you put a guy in a situation where there are a lot of runners on base, he's going to drive in a lot of runs, and so you say, hell, I'm right. I put this guy drives in runs because I put him in the situation where that's all he could do if he got base hits.
Let me just say one thing about RBIs, that there is a largely unknown record. We all know that Hack Wilson drove in 191 or perhaps 190, depending how you're counting. In the American League, Gehrig and Greenberg each had 183, contested, maybe somebody had 185, can't keep up with the revisionism. But there is a stat in which Nate Colbert is the all-time RBI leader because in 1971 or 72, he drove in 22.75% of all the runs the San Diego Padres scored that year. No one in the history of baseball, not Gehrig, not Ruth, not Greenberg, not Sam Thompson, has ever touched this number. Does it make Nate Colbert the greatest clutch hitter, the most productive hitter in the history of baseball? No, but it does testify to the weakness of the RBI stat.
I don't know, I
there's a
might
lot-
take Nate Colbert over Babe Ruth. That's a pretty good stat.
There's a lot of young people in the audience and a lot of people who come to these conventions and aspire to a career that didn't exist when we were all young and their ages. What advice would each of you give to a young person who would like to be in a position to make a living dealing in the areas that you all deal with? And I'll start with you, John Dewan, come right down the line.
Okay, yeah, in fact, I get emails all the time from young people who want to get into the field. And so what I tell them is, first of all, do your own research. Start doing your own work. Look at things that you find interesting. Become adept at, if you're a numbers guy and you want to get into numbers, become adept with using a computer. And I'm not just talking about necessarily being able to understand how to work with Excel, although, spreadsheets are tremendously powerful. But, being able to do things like code and SQL and work with databases is a big deal. But, as a lot of you who have been successful, it's about coming to events like this and showing the work that you can do, and sharing your research, putting it online. Everybody can read it if you put it out there, and if it's good work, it will get published. Try to hook up with sites like Hardball Times or Baseball Prospectus, or they're just good places where you can try to publish your work. And then the last thing I would mention is, if you feel like you're very adept, at our company, we hire 80 or so video scouts every single year. We're in December and January. We're always looking for more people who can come in and scout games for us by looking at video. So we've sent many of our people who work for us on to work for major league teams. So it's been a kind of a nice feeding ground for young people to get into the business.
Well, I think John's comments are all on target. Actually, I never wanted to do this full time. I enjoyed doing it, and I was very fortunate to be in situations where I could. I think I'm a really lucky person, but to be honest, but I would say if you love it, you don't have to make it your career, and that might be worth considering. The skills, the computer skills, they're going to be so relevant in our future of all of us. So you can learn the tools, you can learn the techniques. If baseball is what you want to study, and if you wind up applying them in other areas, more power to you.
I think statistical analysis and sabermetrics, as has been attested to by others at this conference, is a frame of mind. It's a habit. It is not a toolbox. So my advice to anyone wanting to break into baseball from an analytical point of view would be, do not limit your studies to baseball alone. Don't become the guy who can win the bet at the barbershop. There are tons of people. Every bar room has somebody who knows something about baseball that you don't know. This will be eternally true. Learn everything you can about the wide world, and think about how baseball might connect to it, or how it might connect to baseball. I think if there is a royal road to success in baseball, it's in knowing a thing or two about the wide world.
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's an answer to that question. I mean, in my case, I never thought about it, to be honest with you. And I've been very lucky with things that have happened to me and friends that have helped me. But I just started out with trying to do something that I enjoy doing. And, sometimes you can make a career out of it, and sometimes it's just a hobby. And I just consider myself very lucky.
All right, some questions from the audience. Yesterday, there was some talk about a new statistic for pitchers, the QOP, quality of pitch. And this questioner would like your frank opinion about QOP as a statistical measure for pitchers.
Well, I actually talked to the people after they gave the talk, so I'm not saying anything I didn't tell them. I think it clearly measures something. I mean, it's great data to accumulate, and there's useful analysis there. It's not altogether clear to me that we yet know enough about its effect to be able to claim what you can do with it, but it is data, carefully accumulated data, and it can be valued for that point. I'm just not sure whether the implications are all that were also mentioned.
Yeah, just because you know something or can find something out doesn't mean that it's going to bear fruit, but I'm with Dick on this. It bears further analysis.
Okay, here's a good one. Which player or players from all of your research through the years would you regard as one of or the most underrated player from your deep research and you're looking at numbers?
Well, one of the things I do is calculate an overall player rating for a career and make a list and compare it to the Hall of Fame. And right now, the highest rated player who is not in the Hall of Fame, who is not eligible to be voted on, or is not currently playing, is Bobby Grich. Now, Bobby Grich, to most people, they don't really have much of an opinion on it, but I have him rated at about 50 wins better than average for a player, where 30 should be a Hall of Fame lock, and anybody down to 20 should be a good choice. And it was strange because back in the 70s, Gene Autry was trying to put a team together and signing free agents. He signed Reggie Jackson, Rod Carew, and Bobby Grich. Now, in my system, those guys are all about the same. But the difference was Rod Carew had a very identifiable characteristic. He had a high batting average. Reggie Jackson had a very high characteristic. He hit a lot of home runs.
And talked a lot.
Bobby Grich did a lot of things well. He was a good fielder. He had a decent batting average. He had a few home runs. He got on base a lot. He played a position that was difficult as a fielder. And if I recall right, he got like 3 votes his first election. And if you get less than 5% of the vote, you're off the ballot. And that's where he stands. And there are guys like Darrell Evans, who was sort of in that category, but not so high. And my other high-rated guy was Earl Dhawan, who was a 19th century player who came close in the last couple of old-timer elections, but hasn't made it. But I don't know, I think if you want to be a star, you're better to have one overriding characteristic, like Nolan Ryan striking people out, or something that catches the fans' emotions, or the voters and the writers, because if you're sort of good at a lot of things, it just doesn't show up.
John, you have somebody?
Yeah, I agree with all three that Pete just mentioned, but I would add Dick Allen, and I would add Minnie Minoso, not for statistical reasons purely, but because if the Hall of Fame has one abiding characteristic for its inductees, it should be obvious in the name of the institution. You were famous. Now, Minnie Minoso was famous till the day he died, and for good reason, but I don't advocate for inclusion or exclusion from the Hall of Fame. I believe that's the province of others who do, by and large, a very good job. Since 1936, there's only a handful of people who are obvious candidates from an analytical point of view who are out.
George?
I don't have a lot of people to add to Hall of Fame list. These gentlemen have studied this more recently than I have. I think of players who, again, of course, I think of players who walked a lot and weren't noticed in having that skill. How many here know of Roy Cullenbine? I got a hand, two hands. This guy still holds the Detroit Tiger record for walks in a season, I believe. But that's what he did. Maybe I'm wrong. He did it one time. But he was a guy who walked an awful lot. Nobody thought much of it at the time. He got traded from club to club. But the guy could really play.
Okay, I'm going to mention three players. So you just mentioned Minnie Minoso, may he rest in peace. He was the second best hitter in the entire decade of the 1950s in the American League, behind Mickey Mantle. And we did this statistical study for the White Sox a couple years ago when they were campaigning to get him into the Hall. And there are many of us who really feel for the entire body of his work. And I totally agree with you, John, that this man should be in the Hall of Fame. And so Minnie Minoso is one. And then the second two players are a category of player that I hated when I was growing up. I hated the no-hit, good field shortstops that were always in Chicago. I couldn't stand it. I wanted to see hitting out of the shortstop position, and we just never had that in Chicago. And then in the 80s and 90s, we got a guy who was another no-hit, good field shortstop, but he was entertaining, and he was a hot dog, and I think he was underrated. And when we started doing fielding analytics, it started to show that Ozzie Guillen was one of the best defensive shortstops in the game, so he was a lot of fun. And then the other guy, who remembers Adam Everett? Yeah, Adam Everett played in the early 2000s, and he was a tremendous no-hit, good field shortstop, and we showed that he was saving 30, 40 runs a season with his defense. And I think his record was just broken last year when he had 40 runs in a season that he saved. So those are a few of my underrated players.
Actually, there's one question here for me. What's happened at ESPN regarding statistics? I came to ESPN in 1988, and on April 15th, we hired our first researcher named Howie Schwab, later known as Stump the Schwab. And today, we have a department of 253 people who do some form of research or responsible for the bottom line. We just started about 4 or 5 years ago. I've been campaigning for at least 10 years, maybe more, to get into advanced analytics. We call it next level. And we have a bunch of people, especially in baseball, Jeff Bennett. We have Ed Macedo, who runs our research group. And we're beginning to get to the point where OPS and on-base average are ingrained. The hardest part we have, as I mentioned earlier, is convincing the announcers we can convince. Play-by-play announcers, studio hosts. It's the former players and the former coaches who have a hard time. And I asked this question last year on a panel, and Manny Acta was up here. And Manny Acta said, the reason we don't use some of these numbers, John, is because when you go to a player to have a discussion and you begin to discuss numbers and the first thing you say is minus, the player is not going to listen. The last question I have, John, Dewan, is directed to you, and it's a very interesting question. With all the shifting that is going on in baseball, does shifting enhance, rightfully or wrongfully, enhance a fielder's value because his metrics are better, because he's in a better position to play defense on a particular batter?
Actually, I think shifting helps the poorer defenders by getting them into the proper position where they don't have to range as far to try to make a play. So I think, a couple years ago, we separated our shift run saved out of, we were crediting players with too many runs saved because of their shifting. Like Brett Lowry was playing second base and he was getting credit for balls as a third baseman because he got put over into that deep, that short right field position. So I think it's actually more to the credit. It's a better strategy, and the Milwaukee Brewers proved this. They had one year in the 4 worst defenders in all of baseball. They had Fielder at first, and Mark Reynolds at third, and I forget who they had at second and short, but the previous year they had by far the worst defense in first base in terms of the number of runs that it cost them. And then the next year when they started employee shifting, those individual fielders all had improved years. So it was really, it was Casey McGahee at third, not Mark Reynolds. But yeah, it was. I think it's a better strategy for the worst defenders.
We're getting close to the end now, so we're going to ask Pete to kick it off and give a closing comment on something that you want to emphasize, or maybe something that we haven't touched upon and we should have touched upon. So, Pete, why don't you start us off?
Okay, well, I appreciate being here, and I just have a pet peeve, and that is for all your Pythagorean users out there, I prefer my method, which is very simple. You take runs scored minus runs allowed, divide by 10. You get the same answer, and you don't need a calculator.
John?
A comment that I think I may have shared with analytics panel viewers 2-3 years ago was that I believe my colleagues on the panel feel like Rip Van Winkle, that we have awakened 20 years later, having set in motion a sabermetric ripple, which has become a wave, not yet a tsunami. That's an unfortunate metaphor in any event, but the scale, the scope, the advance of analytics into Major League Baseball itself was unimaginable. We always believed that we were going to be on the outside looking in. Some of us are now on the inside looking out, and those of a certain age, like those on this panel, just look at it all with marvel and wonderment and confessed pleasure.
This may sound a bit corny, but I have really enjoyed the group of people that you see talking to you before. I have another scientific career in which people fight and bicker about lots of things that don't matter very much, but this group is always, and Pete in particular, I want to make it clear why I'm here. When Pete and I first contacted each other, Pete had a whole lot more to teach me than I had to teach him. And that the relationship he talks about between runs and wins was always very clear, at least when I knew Pete. And that's the foundation, again, as John Thorn has emphasized, for everything else we do.
Analytics has been, for all of us up here, hugely successful for our careers, and we have turned something that was a hobby into a livelihood and into for me, a career and just something that I love doing. And I wanted to just mention a person who was very instrumental in my career, and that person was our director of IT at STATS and did incredible amount of work. Dick and I were involved with creating STATS, but this person ran our entire IT department, and it was all about, making the computers sing the numbers of baseball. And that's my wife, Sue Dewan, who's sitting right there. Sue, raise your hand.
Let me second that.
What a great conference, guys.
And also Bill James. It's a pity he's not here. That would have made the perfect panel. But I think everybody up here thinks as highly as you can of Bill James, the man.
I think others have said it, and I wish Bill were here to hear it, but he is, I believe, the most important non-player, the most important person off the field in the history of baseball, with the single exception, perhaps, of Henry Chadwick.
It was 1982, and I was editing a magazine called Inside Sports for Newsweek, which failed miserably economically, but was an aesthetic success. And I had Bill write an article because I was a big fan dating back to the mimeograph days. And Bill wrote an article which to this day just amazed me. He wrote an article that the team that's going to win the World Series is the team that's going to dominate by hitting triples. How? Why? But he wrote a full article to prove it. Anyway, join me in thanking these wonderful gentlemen for an entertaining hour.
I think they did a good job.